Hey guys, today we're talking about the multiplier effect. We kind of introduced it yesterday when we were talking about average and marginal propensities to consume and to save. And today we're talking about how a change of spending has a multiplied effect on GDP and how a little bitty change of aggregate demand can have a big impact on our national income as a country. So our MPC and MPS can help us figure out what the multiplied effect will be. Is it $1 going to have a 2 times effect on GDP, a 10 times effect on GDP, somewhere in between? And so there's two multipliers that we're going to talk about today. One of them is called the spending multiplier, and the other one we're going to talk about is called the tax multiplier. And the spending multiplier is on the screen. The spending multiplier we're going to call KS, S for spending, and I believe K is often used as a multiplier in different formulas in like physics and calculus, I have heard. We'll see. So KS is the spending multiplier, and to figure out how much your spending will have an effect on GDP, you can solve it in one of two ways. Either KS, the spending multiplier, is 1 over MPS, meaning the marginal propensity to save, or 1 over 1 minus MPC. Either of these will work because 1 minus MPC is MPS. So you can use either denominator. I'm always going to stick with the fewest steps denominator. So I'm going to always think of 1 over MPS. And so what do I do with this number? Well, I throw it into the second equation that you see here on the screen. You see that some sort of change in spending right here. It could be a change of C, consumption, I, investment spending, G, government spending, or net exports. Any change of those aggregate demand shifters times KS. That's going to give you how much GDP is going to actually change by. So this is the dollar that you spend. This is the multiplied effect on the economy it's going to have. And here's the result. So let's just say you spend like $1 and the multiplier is like 2. So it's going to be 1 times 2 is going to have a 2 times effect on GDP. But I have an example here at the bottom of the screen. It says if the MPC of a country is, this is basically how it's going to be worded on a test or a quiz. If the MPC of a country is 0.75 and the government increases spending by $1 million, what happens to GDP? Okay, so you have your change of spending, 1 million. So you can put that directly into this formula right here. Because this end formula right here, that is what you are trying to solve for. You have to often solve for KS first, but the end result is this equation, this second equation. And so the change of spending is $1 million. We have to figure out what KS is if we're going to solve for real GDP. Because the question's asking what happens to real GDP, so that's what we're solving for. So KS is our spending multiplier, 1 over MPS. Well, MPS isn't given to you. Not really. It tells you MPC is 0.75, and MPS plus MPC is always equal to 1. So if I know that MPC is 0.75, I can just subtract 0.75 from 1 to get MPS, which is 0.25. So KS is 1 over MPS, or 1 over 0.25, because that is the marginal propensity to save for this problem. 1 over 0.25 is going to be equal 4. So in the past, the AP exam has not allowed the use of a calculator. Of course, last year, during test of 2020 was kind of up in the air, and calculators were allowed to be used because they couldn't stop people from using them if they were at home. I have no idea what's going to happen this year. I know that some people will be testing from home. I don't know how it's going to work. So you should be able to do this either in your head or with a calculator. Either way, I would not be too heavily focused on calculator. You should be able to do this in your head. On our tests and things, they're going to be timed. So if you're having to look at a formula sheet and try to plug things into the calculator, you might run out of time. So you need to be able to do these formulas in your head. Be prepared for that. So 4, 1 over 0.25 is 4. And there are some of you guys that are like in calculus and really high levels of math, and you can easily do this in your head. So what I'm about to say is not to you. It's to everybody else, the people that are like me, that are not very strong in math. So how do you solve 1 divided by 0.25 in your head? So different ways. There's lots of tools of how to do that. I had to grab a pen really quick. So here you have 1 over 0.25, and you need to be able to solve that in your head. So I know that you can use like fractions within fractions and change this to 1 over 1 over 4, and then you just like flip it to, I honestly don't know how you guys do that. This is how I do it. 1 over 0.25. You can move decimal places. Whatever you do on top, you have to do to the bottom, and vice versa. So remember, 1 is just like 1. That's the same. So I'm going to move my decimal place over 2 times. Make this 100. Whatever I did up there, I now have to do to the denominator. And now it's just 100 divided by 25, which is 4. You don't have to move any decimal places like back. It's just 4. It's the same number. You can also think of math. I do this a lot as well. So this is 25 cents. If you have, like, how many 25 cents go into $1? 4 25 cents. 4 quarters go into $1. So you can either move decimal places over and get one answer. You can think of math and like how many of these coins go into this 4, or you can do like fractions within fractions and flip and cross, and I don't even know how this works. Big question mark. But you have to be able to do it in your head. Like that is necessary. Okay, so what do you do with this 4? What do you do? That is your spending multiplier. So you multiply that by, you'll never guess what, spending, because it's the spending multiplier. So you're going to multiply it by the spending to get a change in GDP. Well, the spending was $1 million. We just solved the multiplier is 4. So it's 1 million times 4, which is $4 million. So if the government decides to spend $1 million for whatever reason, if this is the case for the NPCs and NPSs, then GDP will actually increase by $4 million. It has a 4 times effect because our multiplier was 4. So I'm going to give you some practice questions. They are going to be challenging. It is a skill that you need to practice because we're going to be doing these spending multiplier problems for every test from here on out. Okay, so spending has a great impact on GDP, but so do a change in taxes. A change in taxes also has a big effect on GDP. So there is a spending multiplier, but there's also a tax multiplier. And the tax multiplier calculates, just like before, how much GDP will change by if there's a change of taxes. And the reason that taxes would change our spending is like taxes get taken out of our income. So if they take more or less taxes from our income, that changes how much disposable income we have and how much money we can spend. So if they take a big chunk out of my paycheck, I can't spend as much. Or if they take less money out of my paycheck in the form of taxes, I might have more money to spend. So taxes affect people's spending. I don't want you to think of this changing government spending, because the government's going to spend no matter what taxes are. They'll just run a deficit or whatever. But people can't do that. It affects people's spending. So here's the tax multiplier formula. KT, this time for tax multiplier, KT is equal to negative MPC over MPS. Or you can think of it as negative MPC over 1 minus MPC, but I'm always going to stick with the first one, negative MPC over MPS. Okay, so what do you do with this tax multiplier? You multiply it by the taxes. Surprise. So you multiply the tax multiplier by taxes, and you multiply the spending multiplier by spending. Either way, it's going to have a change in GDP, a multiplied change in GDP. So here is the next question. Another type of question that you would be asked. If the MPC of a country is 0.75, and this is the same MPC that we used in the previous problem, if the MPC of the country is 0.75 and the government decides to decrease income taxes by $1 million, what happens to GDP? Okay, so we got a change in taxes right there, a decrease of $1 million. So the change in taxes is going to be negative, because this was a decrease. Otherwise, if it was like they raised taxes, it would be plus. But it's going to be negative $1 million times the tax multiplier. So what is the tax multiplier? It's negative MPC over MPS. MPC is given, but remember, if you have MPC, you already know MPS because them together equals 1. So if MPC is 0.75, MPS is going to be 0.25 because those added together equals to the number 1. So MPC over MPS, negative MPC over MPS is negative 0.75 over 0.25, which is negative 3. Once again, you need to be able to do these division problems in your head. You have to divide negative 0.75 divided by 0.25 in your head. And once again, there's many ways to do this. All right. One of these days, I'm going to get like a better like selfie stick, but right now my camera is literally like paper clipped to a ruler. So, yay. Okay. So negative MPC over MPS. That is the tax multiplier. It's always negative. And the reason that it's negative, it's because of the relationship between taxes and GDP is a negative one. Higher taxes, lower GDP. Lower taxes, higher GDP. So it's negative to represent the relationship. That's why it's negative. Okay, so negative MPC over MPS. MPC was given to you 0.75, but remember, it's going to be negative 0.75 divided by 0.25. Okay, so you can do this in one of 3 different ways. You guys can, if you know your fractions of like what decimals are what fractions, you can be like, oh, that's 0.75, that's 3 over 4, negative 3 over 4 divided by 1 over 4. And you guys, I honestly don't know how, like, you can just cross off and be like, oh, and you get the answer. But I like it like this, negative 0.75 over 0.25. You can move the decimal place over, make that 75 divided by 25. And that's negative 3. Or you can think of it like math again, negative 0.75 divided by 0.25. That 0.25, that's a quarter. That's like, that's 25 cents. How many 25 cents go into 75 cents? 3 25 cents make up 75 cents, negative 3. So either way you solve for like negative MPC over MPS, you're going to get the same answer. So make sure you pick which type of math you want to do and what works for you. Balance. All right. So my tax multiplier is negative 3. So what does that mean? The government decreased taxes by 1 million, negative 1 million. And we're going to multiply that by our tax multiplier, which is negative 3. 1 million times negative 3. Our GDP is going to increase because remember, negative, like 1 million times negative 3 million is going to be positive 3 million. Those two negatives kind of cancel out. So the increased by $3 million. All right, so I'm going to give you some practice. Just a second, hold on. Here we go. But I want to see if anyone can make the connection between math, the math that I just gave you, and like how the economy works. When I first started teaching, we were in the financial crisis of like 2008, the Great Recession. And now I've been teaching about 13 years and a recession is beginning again. And usually the government does something about it. Usually. They usually spend a whole bunch of money to get us out of a recession because government spending goes up, GDP goes up, recession solved. Or they cut taxes, making consumption increase as people have more money to spend, and GDP goes up, and bam, we're out of a recession. My question is, do you know which one they do more often? And can you tell me why? because look at the math. MPC and MPS were the same for both problems. Our spending multiplier had MPC 0.75. Our tax multiplier had MPC of 0.75. The government did the same type of amount change. They either raise spending by $1 million or cut taxes by $1 million, which is going to create a deficit. Either way, they either spend money that they don't have or they bring in less money. It's going to cause a deficit of $1 million by too much spending or too little taxes. Why would they pick one over the other? Look at the result of what happened to GDP for spending. Look at the result of what happened for GDP for the taxes. Which one do you think that they do most often, and why do you think it is? So I'm posing this question. We'll talk about it later. But here are some more practice questions. The multiplier effect refers to. What does it refer to? Okay, I gave you some time to answer the question. The multiplier effect refers to any change in aggregate expenditures creates a bigger change in GDP. Aggregate expenditures means spending. Total spending is another way to say aggregate demand. So be familiar with aggregate expenditures. It's just a different way to say aggregate demand. And here is another type of question. Imagine that investment spending, that's I, it's still spending. It doesn't have to necessarily be government spending. Imagine that investment spending increases by $10 billion and the MPC is 0.8. Ooh, we're dealing with different MPCs this time. The aggregate demand curve will shift. Okay, before you even do any of the math, you could probably eliminate some of these problems just based on the fact that investment spending is increasing and which direction aggregate demand curve will shift. Will it go leftwards or rightwards? So I'll give you some time and then we'll do this. Okay, so let's do the math. So investment spending is spending. So we're going to be using KS, which is the spending multiplier, which if you remember is 1 over MPS. All right, MPS isn't given in this problem, but MPC is. MPC is 0.8. I know that, and so I know MPS, which is 0.2, because those added together equal 1. So MPS is our denominator for our spending multiplier, 1 over 0.2. 1 over 0.2. Oh, I don't have a calculator. Maybe I'm not allowed to use one. I don't really know. And so 1 over 0.2, you can think of it as 1 over 1/5. Or you can think of it as moving a decimal place over, making this a 10, making this a 2. Or you can think of it as, this is kind of a stretch, but that's 20 cents. How many 20 cents fit into $1? How many double dimes go into $1? 5 double dimes go into $1. Either way, the answer is 5 either way. So 5. Okay, 5. I have a number. I don't know what to do with that. Well, what is that number? Oh, that number was KS, the spending multiplier. And the spending multiplier should always be multiplied by spending. So 5 times the amount of spending we just had was $10 billion in the problem. So we are going to have an increase, and I know it's an increase because investment spending is increasing and not decreasing, of $50 billion. An increase is a shift to the right. So a rightward shift by $50 billion at each possible price level, which was option E. E as in excellent and elephant, and isn't this exciting? Okay, so let's review. This is a review for the last 4 days? Honestly, I don't know. Aggregate demand measures total spending in the economy and directly affects GDP because the things that make up aggregate demand, CIGXN, that's the GDP equation. The average and marginal propensities, APS, APC, MPC, MPS, they give the idea of how much people save and how much people spend of their income. The spending multiplier calculates how much GDP and aggregate demand changes when there's a change of spending. And the tax multiplier calculates how much GDP and AD changes when there's a change in taxes. Remember that the tax multiplier is a negative number since there is a negative relationship between taxes and GDP. And when it comes to KS and KT, KS being the spending multiplier, KT being the tax multiplier, assuming that MPC and MPS remain constant, the spending multiplier, KS, will always be larger than the tax multiplier, KT. And therefore, a change in spending will yield a larger change in GDP than a change in taxes by the same amount. So I was kind of hinting at that earlier. The government, to get out of a recession, could either change spending or they could change taxes. And no matter what the MPC and MPS is, KS, the spending multiplier, will always have a bigger impact on the economy, which is why the government chooses to spend itself out of a recession versus like lowering taxes out of a recession, because the spending just works more. So, and here is a KS and KT calculation hint. KS will always be one more and positive than KT. So if KS is the spending multiplier is 4, like we just had in the problem that we did with 1 million taxes and 1 million spending, the KS was 4, well, KT is going to be negative 3. If KS is 10, KT with the same MPC and MPSs will be negative 9. And if KS is 5, like we just did, KS was 5, then KT, if that had been a tax multiplier problem, KT would just be negative 4. It's one less and negative. That's the relationship. So do you have to memorize all of these equations? Not really, just a couple, because you know the relationship between maybe MPC and MPS. Added together, they equal 1. If you know KT, you also know KS. And so there's relationships that you can see being built here. So it's not a lot of math, but it is going to be something that we're going to be dealing with for the rest of the semester. So it's not difficult, but you have to know what a question is asking, what information you have, what information you don't, and then using some process of elimination to solve whether, should it shift to the right, should it shift to the left, knowing your shifters and things like that will be very, very helpful. Okay, that is it for today. Bye, guys.